A small man-made island in the South China Sea is seen from above. The island is a narrow ring with a small inlet allowing water into the interior of the island. Figure 14. 1. In an attempt to expand its presence in the South China Sea, China is beginning to construct artificial islands, which are being used as a base for Chinese military operations. Their proximity to U.S. allies, such as the Philippines, creates some concern about the role China wishes to play in asserting its control over what goes on in Southeast Asia. Credit: One of the Militarized Islands by China off the coast of Philippines by Tony Peters/Flickr, CC by 20. Chapter outline. 14. 1. What is power and how do we measure it? 14. 2. Understanding the different types of actors in the international system. 14. 3. Sovereignty and anarchy. 14. 4. Using levels of analysis to understand conflict. 14. 5. The realist worldview. 14. 6. The liberal and social worldview. 14. 7. Critical worldviews. The study of international relations is a subfield of political science that focuses on the ways that different states interact with one another. The main goal of all relationships among states is to work toward making the international system one of peace, friendly, nonviolent relations among states, and balance, an equal distribution of the chance for any country to take the lead in setting the course for the international system. As with all things related to politics, who has the means to exert their power to guide the action of members of the political community determines who gets to set the terms of peace and be in charge of what balance looks like. Power can best be defined as the ability to establish and enforce the rules to which all other actors in a system must adhere. This chapter looks at the different players in the international system and how they interact. It examines the principles that guide the establishment of the political, social, and economic environment in which these interactions take place. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to define power as it applies to international relations. Describe the different types of power political actors may possess. Simply defined, in international relations, power is the ability of a state to prompt its preferred outcome in a given situation. States aim to protect their sovereignty, their authority to govern themselves, and guard against attacks from other countries. Growing and projecting their strength is the means through which they achieve this goal. The way a state sees its place within the larger system, based on the worldview its policy makers adhere to, serves as the foundation for the state's power. The theories discussed in this chapter will help illuminate the role power plays in international interactions. They describe the different methods states use to exert their power, and how the application of the levers of state power can lead to an increase in a state's ability to chart its own course, and to induce other states to support its attainment of its preferred outcomes. At the same time, the theories describe how other states characterize the state's actions and determine their responses to those actions. A state's power includes its military, political, economic, and soft power. The more states attend to and invest in the development of each of these elements of the power they wield, the greater their potential to have an impact on the international stage. Military power. States that function with a general sense of self-preservation and a broad mistrust of other members of the international community see the military as the most important means for the projection of their power. The application of military power can be active, in the form of an outright attack or an invasion, or it can be passive, as when a state illustrates its ability to prevail in a military confrontation without actually engaging in one. Traditionally, states have launched military offensives against selected targets to secure state power. A more passive way states can exert their power is through deterrence. The buildup of military might to such a level that an adversary state or states reconsider the use of their own military against the primary state. If State A thinks it has a military advantage over State B, State A may be motivated to attack State B, especially if an important resource or other key objective is at stake. Should State B begin to expand its military power, State A might be motivated to reconsider its course of action. Video. Deterrence in Foreign Policy. In this clip, Council on Foreign Relations Adjunct Senior Fellow for National Security Studies, Richard Betts, and Adjunct Senior Fellow for Defense Policy, Stephen Biddle describe how states use deterrence to avoid war. North Korea is an example of a modern state that leans on deterrence through military means. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un chooses to divert a substantial portion, one of the country's relatively meager GDP, toward the military to throw off any plans that any other country might have of attacking it. He does this even at the expense of much-needed domestic spending on things like food and social services. A propaganda poster in the middle of a neighborhood shows four people. A uniformed soldier wearing a helmet and carrying a gun is in the lead, followed by a worker wearing a helmet and coveralls, followed by a person in a suit carrying a roll of paper and a T-square, followed by a peasant farmer holding grains. Stylized military jets fly and missiles appear ready to deploy over their heads. Figure 14. 2. As this propaganda poster, photographed in Pyongyang in 2011 shows, in North Korea, the military is the first priority. Credit, propaganda by Michael Day/Flickr, CC by 20. A state can also obtain military protection by entering into a security pact, an agreement among multiple states to support each other in case of a military attack, such as NATO or the Warsaw Pact. For more on NATO, see the discussion of collective security in 14. 5. The Realist Worldview and Chapter 15, International Law and International Organizations. Economic power. A state can have both internal economic power, with a strong domestic economy marked by increasing gross domestic product, GDP, and/or a currency that allows the state to purchase goods and services at a relatively low cost, and external economic power, with leverage in international economic relationships. Externally, a state can project its economic power to the rest of the world in its international trade relationships and its participation in international economic organizations, such as the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. States can also increase their economic power relative to other states by controlling more of the basic factors of production. There are four basic factors of production, that is, four levels of economic development: primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. The primary level of economic development focuses on agriculture, the secondary focuses on manufacturing, the tertiary focuses on the service industry, and the quaternary focuses on research and development. When one state controls more of the basic factors of production and can create a particular good or service in a more cost-effective manner than a second state, the first state is said to have a comparative advantage in the production of that good or service. Comparative advantage allows a country to strategically invest in the factors of production: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship within its borders in order to develop goods or services that make it a preferred resource for consumers versus other countries. Consider one classic example of comparative advantage. If England needs the same amount of resources to create 5 yards of cloth as it does for the country to produce 1 barrel of wine, and with the same resources, Portugal can create 5 barrels of wine, but only 1 yard of cloth, then we can say that Portugal has a comparative advantage over England in making wine, and England has a comparative advantage over Portugal in making cloth. Therefore, it would be better for England to focus on cloth production and for Portugal to focus on wine production, with each country trading for the goods it needs that the other country can produce more efficiently. Video. Draw me the economy. What is comparative advantage? This animated video clip explains, in simple terms, how comparative advantage works in a free market. China provides a contemporary example of a state that uses its place in the international economic system to extend its power. The Chinese government has taken care to ensure its position as the preeminent global resource for manufacturing. 2. With a large, educated labor force and a government that has a tight control over businesses and their functions, China has the ability to turn out large amounts of goods at a relatively low cost to consumers. 3. In manufacturing, it has a comparative advantage over other states. Internally, a state can use the levers of monetary policy to alter the value of its currency to encourage domestic consumer spending and make its exports relatively more attractive. By creating economic linkages between states through trade, countries are able to expand the reach of their goods and their money, increasing their country's economic strength relative to other countries. A state can use its economic power to build a relative economic advantage, creating an environment in which other states seek to join the state in mutually beneficial trade relationships. As a state creates more economic relationships with other states, it solidifies its position as an economic power and is able to use access to other states, factors of production or comparative advantage to further cement its own place in the larger system. Political power. States can try to manipulate the political institutions of other countries to enlarge their sphere of influence and to pressure other states to implement their preferred policy outcomes. A state can use both overt and subversive means to influence another state or a non-state actor in order to gain more power for itself. For example, a state can influence the outcome of an election, supporting the candidacy of a leader who is friendly to the state's preferences. In 1911 and 1912, the United States did not hide its efforts to influence elections in Nicaragua. In 1953, the United States played a role in the coup in Iran that removed that country's prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who, in nationalizing the Iranian oil industry, had threatened Britain's long-standing control over oil in the region. After the ouster of Mossadegh, the last Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, with whom the United States believed it had a beneficial relationship, returned to power. Some states have denied prominent accusations of interfering in other countries' elections, as Russia has in response to accusations that it interfered in the 2016 election in the United States. When states have a sense of power, within the system or within a region, they will do what they can to create an environment that safeguards and even expands that power. Video: How did the United States intervene in Iran in 1953? In this clip, Professor Joanne Hart of Lesley University and the Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs at Brown University discusses the U.S. overthrow of Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. The next section discusses in greater depth how and why it is important to a state that other states recognize its state sovereignty. Using its power of recognition, a state can welcome into the international system and its institutions another state that it believes will support its desired goals, thereby increasing the likelihood that the norms of the international system will align with its preferences. By the same token, a state can withhold its recognition of another state in order to maintain better relations with other members of the international community. In the case of Taiwan, the United States walks a fine line in terms of recognition and interstate relations. China views Taiwan as an extension of China and expects all other countries to treat Taiwan as such. This puts the United States in a tricky position. The United States, for economic, military, and diplomatic reasons, seeks to maintain a positive relationship with China, but its broader goal is to support countries as they attempt to democratize. Taiwan, in recent years, has taken many steps to assert its autonomy in relation to China and to implement a more democratic system. China sees these moves as a direct threat to its own position of power and does everything it can to maintain firm control over the Taiwanese governmental system in Taiwan. China views any U.S. actions that may be supportive of Taiwanese independence or even of its increased autonomy from China in a negative light. The United States must tread carefully, supporting a state that is trying to move toward democracy without angering a key economic and diplomatic ally. Above all else, states must act to protect their sovereignty. In all things, states find themselves most reliant on their own strength and abilities. In an environment in which there is no central governing body to set and enforce rules, countries must strategize to protect themselves at all costs. Soft power. Whereas hard power involves coercion, soft power involves more friendly interactions that seek to win over a state or states, rather than force them to comply with the wishes of one or more other states. Diplomacy, in either a bilateral engagement between two countries or multilateral engagement between more than two countries setting, allows states to create mutually beneficial agreements to protect themselves and the international system at large. The idea that all recognized countries find themselves on equal relational footing and should be treated as such in any sort of engagement, a concept referred to as reciprocity, is the foundational element of any diplomatic relationship. An example of a reciprocal arrangement would be that of states exchanging ambassadors. When a diplomatic relationship exists, the leaders of states pay official visits to one another and are entertained in a manner that shows deference to their status and prestige in the international system. Allowing for state visits is one way that a state might use the guise of entertainment as a means of persuading a state to take steps that meet its preferences. The principle of reciprocity allows for states to enter into any negotiation on a level playing field. It intones a mutual level of respect between the states. The cultural identity of a state is still another way that a state can expand its sphere of influence. Globalization has allowed for the spread of goods that are clearly identifiable as part of the culture of a specific country. As cultural identifiers spread throughout the world on the back of global commerce, so do the values that typify the originating country's political and social systems. For example, the global spread of clearly identified American brands, such as Levi's, McDonald's, and Coca-Cola, serves to spread American values of choice and product competition. 9. In addition to increasing the amount of revenue American companies see from the sale of their products, the spread of American brands spreads American ideals. 10. A McDonald's is one of a row of stores on a street in New Delhi, India. Figure 14. 3. This McDonald's in New Delhi, India, is an example of the reach of America's soft power. Credit: New Delhi McDonald's by Ryan/Flickr, CC by 2. 0. Reciprocal diplomatic relationships that involve entertaining foreign officials and the spreading of cultural values to exert dominance are examples of the exercise of soft power. That is, using attraction and persuasion rather than coercion to achieve goals. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to describe the major actors in the contemporary international system, discuss the 4 characteristics of a state, differentiate a state and a nation, discuss the relationship between international organizations and powerful states, identify the capabilities of a non-governmental organization. A variety of different actors, each with its own characteristics, preferences, and methods of working, populate the international system. These actors are distinct in what they want, what motivates them, how much and what kinds of power they can wield, and how they interact with each other. Achieving the goals of the international system requires the concerted effort of all of these members. States. The term state is used interchangeably with the word country. All states have 4 characteristics. 11. Land with boundaries. A government or a system of rule. A population that willingly gives its allegiance to that government. Recognition as an equal partner among states. Video. New transitional government of national unity formed in South Sudan. In February 2020, a peace agreement ending the South Sudanese civil war established 10 states, 2 administrative areas, and 1 area with special administrative status under a national unity government. This last piece is perhaps the most important and can be the hardest to achieve. Recognition as a state within the international system of states is an essential norm, a generally accepted rule, institution, or behavior that forms the foundation of international relations. Recognition ensures that a state has a seat at the table. It confers both legitimacy and equality in the eyes of the international community. Changes in political power in a state, such as the election of new heads of government or a change in the majority party in the legislative branch, do not usually affect state recognition. But in cases where there are complete changes to leadership or institutions in a government, concerns arise about whether recognition will continue. With the recent changes to governmental leadership in Afghanistan, for example, the reinstalled Taliban regime will need to take steps to make sure that they are seen as the legitimate source of power in the territory. This recognition is important to the ability of the Taliban to negotiate with other members of the international community for the things the country needs. The international community, for its part, can use the promise of recognition to extract concessions from the Taliban. To be recognized as a member of the international community means being held to the same standards of behavior to which other countries are held. States are a vital part of the international system and serve as leaders in charting the path of the system as a whole. Of all the different parts of the international system, Recognition might not seem adequate to give a state all the rights and privileges that come with statehood, but it is a necessary element of membership in the international system. Taliban fighters sit on top of a Humvee, driving with other traffic in Kabul. Figure 14. 4 Taliban fighters ride a captured Humvee after the fall of Kabul. Credit: Taliban Humvee in Kabul, August 2021, cropped. By Voice of America News/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. There is a subtle difference between the term state and the idea of a nation. A nation is an identity gleaned from a common culture or ethnicity. A state is an institutional infrastructure that allows a society to function. In terms of an ethnic identity, a nation can span states, or a state can be a nation-state, as is the case in Japan, where the government of the state takes extra care to protect the shared national identity of the people who make up the state. 12. There is a broader conversation 13 around what a nation, a state, and a nation-state are and how to think about these distinctions in the modern world. Some scholars argue that the concept of the nation-state is no longer viable because of the state boundary lines created by the colonial powers. As European countries expanded their reach and control to areas far from their shores, they entered areas populated by people for whom the idea of the state, in the European sense, was incompatible with their historical identity. As seen in Iraq, Sudan, and Nigeria, the placement of arbitrarily drawn borders, to the economic benefit of the European colonial powers, and with a clear disregard for the traditional geographic locations of the people, form the basis for the current conversation about whether the idea of a nation-state has a place in the modern international system. 14. Nations can also be considered stateless. In some cases, the historical home of a nation is absorbed into a recognized state, leaving the people of the nation with the choice to either accept the citizenship of the recognized state or remain stateless. Stateless nations find themselves at an intense disadvantage because they typically have limited involvement in international organizations, which prevents them from having a seat at the table on par with other states and nations of the world. Nations such as the Kurds, Bretons, Catalans, and Basques are limited in their ability to govern their people with any sense of autonomy, and have been consistently sidelined and subjected to violence for their wish to have their unique national identity be celebrated and validated. Intergovernmental organizations, institutions made up of multiple state actors who work within a specific set of rules to enact solutions to problems common among multiple states, are known as intergovernmental organizations. Intergovernmental organizations, 15, are the best way to understand the reach and impact of a state's power to structure the environment in which it functions. States with more hard power, that is, with larger economies or militaries, are able to leverage their position among other states to put in place institutional norms that more closely align with their preferences. In short, intergovernmental institutions are a great way for powerful states to become even more powerful. Under the best of circumstances, as in the case of the United Nations, intergovernmental organizations can create a unified sense of pressure to prompt a state to make positive changes or to band states together to support a state that is under attack. In the worst case, international organizations can strong-arm weaker states to agree to the preferences of one state to the detriment of other states, or of the system at large. A group of professionals wearing suits sit in semicircle rows in a boardroom. Figure 14. 5. The Board of Governors of the International Monetary Fund, credit. The Executive Board of the International Monetary Fund, Washington, D.C. April 19, 1999. By International Monetary Fund, public domain. For example, the major world economies have partnered to form the International Monetary Fund, IMF, an intergovernmental organization known as a lender of last resort. 16, where a country turns only after it has exhausted all of its options for funding. 17, that can be counted on to support countries in the direst of economic circumstances. The member states that make up the Board of Governors of the IMF base their offer of support on the role that the struggling country plays in the larger economic system. Other members of the international community have criticized IMF loan decisions for attaching terms to IMF loans that limit the ability of borrower countries to move toward economic stability. As with most intergovernmental organizations, the IMF has been characterized as an extension of the policy preferences of its governing members. This means that the decisions the IMF makes are sometimes seen as a tool powerful states use to set the rules of international borrowing to support countries they consider allies and to punish countries that they see as opposition. Non-governmental organizations. Non-state actors focused on solving problems or filling policy gaps states can't or won't handle themselves are known as non-governmental organizations, NGOs. Traditionally speaking, a non-governmental organization is a non-aligned, third-party group that does not have the same motivations that a state might have. Non-governmental organizations are part of a system that works to benefit people rather than states. NGOs can propose solutions to a state or fill a need that a state might have, usually without being seen as attempting to attack the sovereignty of that state. For example, most states accept medical aid from NGOs like the Red Cross or the Red Crescent. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain why sovereignty is an essential element of states in the international system. Define anarchy in the context of the international system. Explain the relationship between sovereignty and anarchy. Statehood is of vital importance to a nation because it confers sovereignty. Sovereignty is the ability of a state to run its institutions without fear of interference from other states or entities. Sovereignty allows states to enforce their own laws, for better or for worse, allowing a state to exert its power within its own borders and in situations where the state must work to protect its interests. While states' claims to sovereignty allow them to protect their cultural identity, beliefs, norms, and institutions, they can also prevent other states from stepping in to protect the innocent when a state acts in a manner that is counter to the basic norms of human rights and human dignity enshrined in the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 18. The actions a state takes to intervene on behalf of people subjected to violence at the hands of their own government could be seen as acts of aggression. In this case, the state that is perpetrating the violence would be within their rights to take action against the intervening state. In cases of crimes against humanity, such as the genocide in the Balkans 19 and the civil war in Rwanda 20 both in the 1990s, sovereignty allows a state to function as it sees fit, even when it means some citizens of that country will die. States have used the cover of sovereignty to prevent non-governmental organizations from providing aid. For example, the Assad regime in Syria has diverted humanitarian aid intended for civilians caught in the middle of the violence in that country's ongoing civil war, using the aid to fund its own atrocities. 21. At times, states have used the cover of sovereignty to block NGOs from gathering information on atrocities happening within the country, or to decline to participate in negotiations when other states tried to broker peace. Video. International anarchy. Anarchy has a particular meaning in international relations that likely differs from the meaning you might be familiar with. This video clip clarifies the concept of anarchy in this context, contrasting it with the concept of hierarchy. A system made up of actors focused on protecting their own interests naturally results in anarchy 22, where there is no overarching governing authority. In the case of the international system, anarchy refers to a lack of a general sense of order in the international system. Anarchy in the international system is directly linked to this lack of enforcement mechanisms as well as a lack of a broad global government. Sovereignty is the most important part of a state's identity. The willingness of states to make sure that their sovereignty is protected for as long as possible ensures that the system will remain anarchic. While each state has the right to govern itself, there is still a need for a means through which different states can gather, some ordered structure in the system that allows states to work through common issues. Intergovernmental organizations, such as the United Nations, provide the forums through which states can attempt to exert pressure on one another to cause one or more states to change a behavior, to provide options other than violence for conflict resolution, or to adhere to already established norms that provide some semblance of order in the otherwise anarchic system. However, there are no true enforcement bodies that have the authority and the capability to impose comprehensive consequences on a state that violates an international agreement or takes actions that fly in the face of generally accepted norms. Intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations provide useful avenues for states to solve problems that impact them at a systemic level. But it is still impossible to say with 100% confidence that a state can be made to behave in a certain way. Foreign aid and sanctions are options available to members of the international community to help move a state into alignment with generally accepted expectations for behavior. Like all types of international actions, the ability of these options to be effective requires the participation of as many members of the international community as possible and the willingness of those states and organizations to close any loopholes so that the target state feels the consequences in a meaningful way. There is no mechanism to force a state to behave a certain way. Foreign aid and sanctions, along with treaties and the actions of international organizations, provide options international actors can use to help order the environment in which a state makes its choices about how it relates to other countries. States can work cooperatively through institutions to enact strategies aimed at coercing a state to change its behavior. However, there is no surefire way to guarantee a state will do so or that it will continue to uphold that change. For example, the United States led a series of negotiations beginning in 2015 to work to curb Iran's development of nuclear weapons. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, more commonly referred to as the Iran nuclear deal, was an agreement signed between Iran and the UK, France, Germany, Russia, and China under the leadership of the United States. Negotiated by the Obama administration, the agreement allowed Iran to re-engage in trade, particularly of their oil, to take some of the pressure off their own economy. And in return, Iran would work to dismantle the nuclear facilities that presented security concerns to the world. Because of the domestic political situation in the United States, the U.S. never recognized the Iran nuclear deal as a ratified treaty, opting instead to enter into an executive agreement. 23. The terms of the treaty would have been binding, but without a formal treaty, the enforcement mechanisms included in the agreement did not ever become reality. When President Obama left office in 2016, the newly elected President Donald Trump began to pull back from the agreement. Trump chose to work separately from the parties to the agreement, reinstating sanctions on Iran, including penalties for entities that continued to trade with Iran. When one key party to an agreement pulls back, other members of the negotiating body are effectively unable to uphold their side of the agreement, and that agreement is weakened. 24. Representatives from China, France, Germany, the EU, Iran, the UK, and the US pose for a photo in front of their respective flags. Figure 14. 6. In July 2015, representatives of China, France, Germany, the EU, Iran, the UK, and the United States posed for a photo during the meetings in Vienna that resulted in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known as the Iran nuclear deal. Credit: Iran Talks by Bundesministeriums für Europäische und internationale Angelegenheiten/Flickr, CC by 2. 0. It may seem counterintuitive to think about anarchy and order going hand in hand when talking about the international system. But the modern system relies on the assumption that states within the system want to maintain control over everything within their own borders and work for their own benefit while at the same time being unwilling to submit to an established order in the environment around them. The tension created in the fight between order and anarchy that exists in all states, no matter how powerful they are, is what underscores and motivates international relations. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to define the different levels of analysis and show how they can be used to explain interstate conflict. Describe the relationship between levels of analysis and state policy. Identify the two purposes levels of analysis serve. Identify the hallmarks of each level of analysis. For 13 days in October 1962, the world watched with bated breath as a shipment of Soviet warheads on their way to Cuba pushed the United States and the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war. In response to the United States' decision to install nuclear weapons in Turkey, a country on the Soviet Union's southwestern border, the Soviet Union began moving multiple nuclear warheads from Russia to the island of Cuba, approximately 100 miles south of Florida at the southeastern edge of the Gulf of Mexico. The fear that this act inspired in Americans led to nuclear attack drills and the constant presence of the threat of war in the lives of everyone in the United States. How would the United States, then led by President John F. Kennedy, respond to this apparent act of aggression? This 13-day standoff has become known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. 25. War or the threat of war draws the attention of the public at large, and, more than any other international event, tends to make people sit up and think critically about the decisions states make. Just as you can seek to better understand political science as a whole by breaking your examination down to the levels of individuals, groups, institutions, and states, and international relations. One way to understand international relations and the decisions actors make is to use levels of analysis. That is, you can choose to zoom in on a particular aspect of the interaction. To better understand the motivations of the actors in the larger system, it is useful to break down the analysis. In international relations, you can examine the individual, focusing on the actions that leaders in a country take, the state, focusing on the actions of countries, and the global system, focusing on how states interact with international organizations, non-governmental actors, and multinational corporations. States create policies, such as the decision to go to war or to solve a problem through negotiation and the creation of a treaty with the assistance of an international organization like the United Nations, that focus on either a specific level or the way that the levels interact with one another. Conflict occurs when the policy decisions of one state create consequences for another state that change the environment, harming the second state or complicating the decisions it must make. 3 circles of decreasing size show the levels of analysis in international relations. The outermost circle is the system, the circle in the middle is the state, and the innermost circle is the individual. Figure 14. 7. We can examine international relations using 3 levels of analysis: the individual, the state, and the system. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 4. 0 license. These levels of analysis serve 2 purposes. They provide a foundation for understanding the different problems states face, and they help one think about how a state's policies can affect the international community. The characteristics and players of each level of analysis give a more holistic way to describe conflict. Individual level. The individual level of analysis focuses on the decision-makers within a state and how the constraints the state places on them affect their chosen courses of action. The rules associated with their positions limit what leaders can do. For example, the President of the United States has the ability to move troops, but cannot formally enter a war with another country without the consent of Congress. 26. This limits the possible policy responses U.S. presidents have to choose from should they feel that the United States is being threatened. Decision makers reliably support policies that solve problems in ways that allow them to claim credit for solutions when they are called to account for their actions. Leaders like to be able to tout their accomplishments in re-election campaigns. They tend to prefer policy solutions that help them gain and keep power. In the case of the individual level of analysis, power is defined as an individual's ability to steer policy to create outcomes that align with that individual's personal beliefs and preferences. State level. The state level of analysis focuses on the actions of states in relation to one another. State-to-state relations occur in the context of intergovernmental organizations and in treaties and alliances. A state's policy choice menu is defined by where the state sees itself and where the state wants to go in relation to other states. When theories of state behavior are discussed later in the chapter, you'll see how theory helps explain the policy choices states make. In the same way that individual political actors must play by certain rules, both the people who live in a state and the international community expect states to uphold norms of behavior and to meet the expectations of the power behind their institutions. In a democracy like the United States, the state derives its legitimacy from the consent of the people. If a state begins to act in a way that goes against what the people say they want, the people can hold individual actors responsible and vote them out of office. The relationship between voters and elected officials is one way to see the relationship between the individual and state levels of analysis. In democracies, voters and those they elect form a feedback loop in which the preferences of the voters are made tangible through the policies that elected officials work to enact in the laws they make. A poster shows the hand and arm of a person reaching to press the lever under the words, "Freedom of Enterprise." Other levers on the machine include freedom of worship, freedom of speech, and freedom of press. Below this image, the poster reads, "Your right to vote is your opportunity to protect. Over here the freedoms for which Americans fight over there." Figure 14. 8. This World War II era poster emphasizes the role the individual plays in directing the state. Credit, "Your right to vote is your opportunity to protect. Over here the freedoms for which Americans fight over there," by Chester Raymond Miller Posters. Artist Posters Library of Congress, public domain. In an autocracy like North Korea, institutions are propped up by the ability of the autocrat to hold the allegiance of the selectors needed to solidify their power. Selectors are the people that a leader in any type of government relies on to legitimize their power and position. In a democracy, selectors are the part of the population who can and do vote. In an autocracy, the selectors are the people who support the leader while at the same time controlling the parts of the country that a leader needs to legitimize their position, such as the military or the lucrative natural resources that the state may control. Global level. The global, or systemic, level of analysis considers how cooperation and conflict among states intersects with the environments in individual states to evoke change. The hallmark of this level of analysis is the number of variables that need to be considered when trying to understand the reasoning behind policy shifts and the ripple effect these shifts have on other countries. For example, though India and Pakistan are not permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, and therefore, according to the terms of the United Nations Charter 27, are not permitted to possess nuclear weapons. 28. Both countries have been developing and maintaining nuclear weapons stockpiles as a high-level deterrent against the possibility that the other country will take overtly aggressive actions. These growing stockpiles of nuclear weapons set the stage for a situation not unlike that between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, one of mutually assured destruction. The usual expectation of the international community would be that states who are not supposed to be in possession of nuclear weapons would be secretive in their development, and even more secretive in their use. Instead, India and Pakistan have chosen not to hide their nuclear stockpiles, and both countries are fully aware of the level of conflict they must avoid to ensure they do not provoke the other country to use its arsenal. The international community has reacted to the nuclear buildup in India and Pakistan in a way that is markedly different from the reaction to the nuclear buildup in North Korea. 29. Because North Korea projects a general sense of distrust and aggression toward most of the members of the international community. And because its tests of its nuclear stockpile are in express contravention to the wishes of the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, the countries of the world see North Korea's actions as a blatant challenge to the international system's fine line between anarchy and order. While India and Pakistan have made it clear that their nuclear arsenal is a tool of last resort, North Korea does not seem to have that same level of restraint. North Korea has promised to use its weapons whenever it feels threatened, but has provided no guidelines regarding what it perceives as a threat. 30. Though India, Pakistan, and North Korea are all violating international law to varying degrees, in choosing to place sanctions on North Korea, but not on India or Pakistan, the global community is choosing to punish a state that, in what the international community perceives to be an irrational manner, seeks to threaten any and all states. In a way, the global level of analysis is one of responsiveness rather than one of agency. A state must first take an action, such as testifying before the United Nations Security Council, before an international organization can respond. The anarchic nature of the international system means that intergovernmental organizations are not able to take meaningful preventive action to head off a state's decision. Due to the anarchic nature of the international system, this level of analysis is the most unpredictable. Its value lies in the way it allows a broad view of any trends in the way events affect different states. The link between policy and the levels of analysis. Levels of analysis can be used to understand how institutions make decisions. Think about each level of analysis as a lens through which policymakers view the possible consequences of implementing a particular solution to a problem they face. Governments can also use levels of analysis to view how a particular situation might affect their country. Each level of analysis represents a different group of people with different wants and needs. Governments have to work to balance the preferences and needs of each member of each level of analysis when they craft and implement a policy. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a classic example of how each of the three levels of analysis plays a role in complex potential or realized international conflicts. Video: The History of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This animated clip investigates the Cuban Missile Crisis in the context of the intense unease and brinkmanship of the Cold War and underscores just how close the United States and the Soviet Union came to starting a nuclear war. At the individual level of analysis, President Kennedy had to consider both his own preferences and how his advisors would want to handle the situation. President Kennedy's immediate circle of advisors, 31 known as ExCom, embodied the facets of the individual level of analysis when they provided the president with their assessment of the crisis and offered possible solutions. Military leaders within ExCom strove to balance their own preferences for how the United States should project strength, favoring large shows of force and more aggressive response measures, with their understanding of who the president was and how he perceived the world around him. In order to get the president to support their plan over any other offered solution, they needed to play to the president's desire to avoid long-term engagement or escalation. It was important to some members of ExCom to persuade the president that a more aggressive response would lead to a more decisive American victory that would send a strong message to Soviet leaders. These members believed that taking a strong stance would dissuade the Soviets from taking further actions against the United States. 32. A group of officials wearing suits work with notepads and other papers around a conference table. Most are seated, although 3 are standing. A portrait of George Washington hangs on the wall in the background. Figure 14. 9 ExCom meets during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Credit: National Security Council Executive Committee, by White House Photographs, John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, public domain. At the state level, President Kennedy had to consider the actions of the Soviets in terms of the preferences of their state. That is, their government institutions, which could override what Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev might want, in order to understand what message they hoped the movement of missiles to Cuba would send. The United States had to be careful about what escalation of conflict could mean in terms of potential danger to people in the United States and in the Soviet Union. Such escalation could also set a precedent for what other states would choose to do if placed in the same situation. At the international, systemic level, the United States and the Soviet Union were involved in back-channel unofficial negotiations with then Secretary General of the United Nations, UTHANT. 33 international law and norms limit what actions countries are willing to allow states to take. And this is especially true when the potential of nuclear conflict threatens the safety of not only the nations involved in a standoff, but also of the entire world. Secretary General Thant appealed to the United States and the Soviet Union to think as rationally as possible, and to provide each other with the space in which to make decisions. Beyond levels of analysis, political scientists use a variety of frameworks to help make sense of the way states respond to the actions of other states. The chapter now turns to those frameworks. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to describe how theories and worldviews can be used to understand international relations. Explain the realist worldview, including fundamental concepts and possible limitations or critiques. Identify and differentiate among various branches of realist theory. Apply principles of game theory to explain a state's decision-making process. Explain the types of polarity in an anarchic system. Discuss the role of comparative advantage in a unipolar system. Analyze the ways tensions can escalate, destabilizing the system in a realist worldview. Several key theories have emerged to explain the different ways states see the world and their place in it, and to understand the decisions they make and the courses of action they choose based on those views. The primary theories come from three major groups of worldviews: the realist worldview, liberal and social worldviews, and critical worldviews. This section discusses realism and its variants. Realism. In popular culture, international relations is usually presented through the filter of the basic tenets of realism. Whether it's Jack Ryan working with the FBI, risking his life to rescue soldiers held by drug cartels, or Jason Bourne running from his past involvement with clandestine operations as a former CIA assassin, representatives of states are shown as engaging in actions focused on self-preservation, no matter the cost. Video. Jason Bourne goes to extremes to avoid capture in the Bourne Ultimatum. In this clip from the 2007 film The Bourne Ultimatum, Jason Bourne goes to extreme lengths, breaking laws and property and putting himself in intense physical peril to avoid being captured or killed. Realism is distinctly characterized by marked self-interest. According to realism, states embark on policy initiatives with a go-it-alone attitude that aims solely to preserve their own safety and security. In a realist's mindset, the state is the primary actor of the international system. According to realists, self-interested states do what they can to gain more power to increase their ability to structure the rules of the system to their advantage. Two bulleted points appear in a horizontal box under the heading Realism. The first point reads states are at the center of the system. The second point reads the main goal of the state is to protect itself and ensure its power. As a general rule, realists believe that states see it as being to their benefit to withhold some of the details about their goals and aspirations in a given situation. The thinking is that if a state is completely transparent about its capabilities and how far it is willing to go to get what it wants, it makes itself vulnerable to other states that might try to take advantage of it. 34. This air of distrust underlies the thinking of a realist state. Because a state cannot trust other states, realists consider diplomacy and negotiations unreliable methods of self-preservation. Instead, realists try to implement policies that send a clear, strong message about the ability of a state to protect itself. Game theory is a way of conceptualizing what motivates a political actor in terms of the steps the actor takes to reach what they deem to be the optimal outcome for themselves. The general discussion of political behavior in Chapter 2. Political behavior is human behavior briefly introduces the idea of game theory. Based on the idea that all the actions players take in a specific game or situation have a certain probability of being taken, game theory helps illustrate a realist view of state strategy in international relations. Have you ever played a game of strategy, such as Risk or Settlers of Catan? In these types of games, you, the player, focus on amassing the most land and resources you can relative to the other players to win. You try to anticipate and consider all the information you have about the current situation and what other players might do when calculating what actions you should take to achieve your goals. In the realist view, states have the same mindset in their interactions with each other. For states, every decision-making process is part of a complicated equation, the result of which is an action the state will take. States weigh the risks and rewards of possible courses of action, seeking the greatest net benefit for their purposes. States can only base their strategic decision-making on the information they have, for example, intelligence information about another state's true motivations, and if that information is faulty, a state's chosen course of action may not achieve the desired results. By accounting for the weight of all the probable variables a state considers in calculating what course it will take versus the benefit a state expects an action to yield, one can calculate the likelihood, or probability, that a state will make a decision or implement a policy in response to another state's actions. Strikers walk a picket line on a city street. Figure 14. 10 game theory can be applied to many situations, such as labor negotiations to end a workers' strike, in which opposing sides strategize to optimize the chances of achieving their desired outcomes. Credit, Picket Line by Susan Jane Golding/Flickr, CC by 20. Realism characterizes states as rational actors, meaning that all the actions they take or policies they implement are a function of what they see as the outcome of a situation. Realists see the international system as a zero-sum game grounded in the idea that all facets of the system are finite. In a zero-sum game, a state seeks to take something, whether it be power or a physical resource, away from another state. In essence, if I win, then you lose, and there can only be one winner. When all aspects of a system are finite, one state can control all of a particular resource, preventing another state or states from having that resource. You can apply this idea to your everyday life. Suppose you and your friend are hungry for a snack, and there is only one bag of chips that is readily available. If this situation were a zero-sum game, whoever got to the bag of chips first would have all the chips, and the other person would have none. The balance of power is a classic realist way of seeing the structure of the international system. Realists see the world as populated by states in a race to set the rules of the system to work for their own benefit. Because the system is inherently anarchic, poles, or centers of power form within the system around the states that have the capacity, in whatever the system deems to be the currency of power, to gather other states to their side. 3 different types of polarity emerge in an anarchic system: unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar. In a unipolar system, one country, the hegemon, sets itself up as the main player who decides the rules of the international system. By virtue of having the strongest economy, largest military, or most stable political and social institutions, the hegemon is able to use its position to extend its power. A hegemon might simply use its military might to extend its power, or it might employ less aggressive means. When a hegemon expands the institutions that benefit it to other countries, it encourages those countries to be like the hegemon. In doing so, the hegemon expands its sphere of influence with the underlying premise that states that are similar in culture, economy, and political structure are less likely to fight one another. While these states share a number of similarities, they have differing abilities to allocate the skills and resources necessary to create certain goods or services. When a hegemon expands its sphere of influence, it expands its access to resources, goods, and services in areas where it lacks a comparative advantage. An imbalance in comparative advantage is what drives a country to trade for a good or service that it needs. In a bipolar system, 2 states with equal relative power, but different underlying institutional characteristics, vie to create opposing spheres of influence. This creates 2 groups of allied countries that allow the states at the center of the poles to expand their power with the support of other actors in the system, giving those 2 states similar strength as if each were a hegemon. In a multipolar world, multiple states form many smaller spheres of influence, creating a pared-down version of a unipolar or bipolar system. A multipolar system, where 3 or more states have equal or relative power, is pared down even further. While anarchy is inherent in the international system, from the realist's view, a state is motivated to create an environment and therefore a balance of power that protects the state. Rational actors prefer order. Order allows actors to have a greater sense of what is coming next. Essentially, states, especially the bigger, stronger, more powerful ones, see anarchy as an opportunity to create order in a way that favors their interests and fits their long-term goals. The balance of power between states is a way to understand who succeeds in creating a world that benefits them the most. The relationship between the United States and Russia from World War II to the present is perhaps the most accessible way to see shifts in polarity in the international system. Before World War II, colonial European powers had divided up the world, and the United States and Russia were doing what they could, in smaller ways, to expand their own reach. After World War II, the United States and Russia emerged as the 2 major powers at opposite ends of the economic ideological spectrum, pitted against each other for supremacy, thus creating a bipolar world. The interaction between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War provides a glimpse of the best and worst of decisions states have made. The Cold War represents a period in world history in which there was a slowly simmering conflict, 35 on multiple fronts, between the Soviet Union and the United States, who had emerged from World War II as the states with the economic strength and political stability to exert their influence and preferences on other states in the international community. A map of the Cold War shows NATO countries, other allies of the United States, countries that are part of the Warsaw Pact, socialist countries aligned with the USSR, other allies of the USSR, and non-aligned nations. It also indicates the location of communist or anti-communist guerrillas. On the map, all countries in the Western Hemisphere, with the exception of Cuba, are either in NATO or an ally of the United States. Most of Western Europe, Australia, and the southern countries in Africa are also either in NATO or allies of the United States. The Soviet Union and many Eastern European countries are part of the Warsaw Pact. Some countries in the Middle East and Northwest Africa are allies of the USSR. Figure 14. 11. This map of Cold War allies illustrates the spheres of influence in a bipolar world. Credit. Map of the Cold War by the 1994 J. Mann/Flickr, CC by 2. 0. The intense competition between these two major world powers for global supremacy spilled into all parts of society. From the propaganda and policies of the United States focused on weeding out suspected communists in all aspects of society and government, to the race to see who could make the greatest advancements in space exploration, which spurred a steep increase in scientific and technological development. In the context of foreign relations, the conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States was more tangible and mired in a number of proxy wars. Conflicts in which each of the warring parties is supported and funded by two larger parties who have a vested interest in the outcome of the conflict. The Vietnam War 36, in which the democratically elected Vietnamese government fought the insurgent Viet Cong, who had the support of the Soviet Union, and the conflict in Afghanistan, where the United States supported Afghanis as they fought to keep the communist forces of the Soviet Union from taking over their country, are two examples of Cold War-era proxy wars. The 1990s brought an end to the Cold War, with the United States emerging as the hegemon, but that came with its own challenges. In the era immediately following the Cold War, newly independent former Soviet states looked to the United States for monetary, political, and military support. This is the burden of the hegemon. When you are the victor in a conflict, you may be seen as the only stable, strong power, and with that status comes a sense of obligation to help less powerful, less stable states. The security dilemma is the byproduct of a system in which states are motivated to act in their own interest. As states implement security policies that aim to either expand or solidify their position in the system, other states may perceive those actions as provocations. The state or states implementing those policies face a security dilemma, where those changes in their policies related to their own safety and security, because they appear aggressive to other states, may lead those other states to preemptively respond in the interests of their own security, potentially ratcheting up tensions between two or more states. This highlights the implications of a system based on a fundamental mistrust of all actors that views any action as a signal. The conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War is a direct long-term example of the consequences of two states existing in the midst of a security dilemma. States that see the actions of another state as an offensive provocation seek to respond in as proportional a manner as possible. But in some cases, as in the hypothetical situation of nuclear war, the response can have consequences that negatively, and in the case of nuclear war, catastrophically, impact the entire international community. Neorealism, the lack of institutions in the international system that can hold states accountable for their actions or provide consistent, altruistic help to states in need, perpetuates the mentality of states that see themselves as lone actors within the international system. In the contemporary international community, realists view states as having a go-it-alone attitude in order to best safeguard their own interests. A more recent offshoot of the realist school of thought, neorealism, also known as structural realism, speaks to states that take a middle path to international relations. 37, like classical realists, neorealists see the state as the main actor in an anarchic system. Unlike classical realists, they contend that it is the structure of the system rather than the people who lead the state that drives the system forward. States that implement policies that align with neorealist ideas attempt to work through international institutions, such as multinational security pacts like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, to get what they want. Two bulleted points appear in a horizontal box under the heading Neorealism, open parenthesis, structural realism, close parenthesis. The first point reads the system is anarchic. The second point reads institutions are structured to maintain the anarchy in the system. Video. Understanding the global community. Realism, neorealism. In this clip, University of Oklahoma professor of international studies, Suzette Grillot explains and differentiates realism and neorealism. Neorealism that advocates for transparency in order to avoid conflict and maintain the status quo is known as defensive realism. 38 In the minds of defensive realists, the constant distrust between states and the resultant policies create an environment of instability that drives states into conflict with one another. As such, these theorists believe that it is to the benefit of all states to maintain the status quo. That is, to maintain the current balance between the states in the system as it exists at that moment. Defensive realists see conflict as a destabilizing force that upsets the status quo and should be avoided. They encourage states to make transparent policy choices meant to give clear signals to other states that they see themselves as a part of and clearly support the anarchy inherent in the system, and that they will not do anything to challenge it. Offensive realism takes the opposite view. According to offensive realism, overt actions states take in order to grow and project their power lead to interstate conflict. 39 These theorists argue that there is an inherent benefit in conflict and in taking self-serving action. States, they say, are intrinsically motivated to seek out power and will do so only by establishing a sense of supremacy over other states, particularly those with characteristics similar to their own. According to offensive realists, states use aggressive actions, whether military, economic, social, or political, to secure their place in the system. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the liberal worldview, including fundamental concepts and possible limitations or critiques, discuss complex interdependence, explain the constructivist worldview, including fundamental concepts and possible limitations or critiques. Liberalism as a worldview differs from liberalism as a political ideology. Ideology is the lens through which an individual makes choices, and, if that individual is in a place of governmental power, through which they view policy options with regard to whether they align with their values. Worldviews, such as the ones listed in this chapter, serve as the basis for how states see the political environment around them and their place in it. Liberalism. In contrast to the realist school of thought, those who adhere to liberalism see investment in the system as a whole, by working within institutions and their constraints to carve out a secure space, as the best way for a state to ensure its protection. Like other theories, liberalism sees states as the primary actors in the international system 40, but liberalism contends that their domestic rules and institutions constrain their actions. As such, states must consider constantly changing factors, both internal and external, when deciding on a course of action. Above all, liberalism views states as motivated by what they see as being in the best interest of the international system. One bulleted point appears in a horizontal box under the heading Liberalism. The point reads states use international institutions to impact the system to their benefit. Collective security, one branch of liberalism, institutionalism, sees international institutions in which states take part as essential to the functioning of the international system. 41 In creating international institutions, whose mere existence seems counter to the expectations of a system described as anarchic, states look to each other to form a web of allies that they can count on for support in times of need. Collective security, 42 Wherein states form alliances to strengthen the security of each member within the alliance, entrenches the idea that no one state can act independently in all instances and emerge victorious. These arrangements are especially beneficial for states with limited resources to put toward their own protection. NATO is one real-world example of an institution designed to promote collective security. Flags from many different countries fly outside of a large building. Figure 14. 12 flags of many countries fly outside NATO headquarters in Brussels, Belgium. Credit 170,517 D SW 162 3038 by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Du De Photo by U.S. Army SGT. James K. McCann/Flickr, CC by 20. Smaller states such as North Macedonia and Bulgaria have limited abilities to divert their country's GDP for investment in modern military armaments. In joining NATO, these smaller countries agree to allow more formidable powers, such as the United States or the United Kingdom, to install military personnel and weapons in their countries, and to use them as a base of military operations in exchange for the promise that the more formidable military power will provide the smaller country with protection should the need arise. In the case of a joint military engagement, the smaller country contributes personnel and financial resources. With the promise of support from more powerful countries, smaller states can deter other states from taking actions against them. All states within the pact, however large or small, are obligated to take part in joint actions. And because all the states in the pact see an attack on one member as an attack on all members, smaller states are assured of protection. Thus, NATO is a true example of liberal international theory and practice. For more on NATO, see Chapter 15, International Law and International Organizations. Complex Interdependence, 43 attempts to cut a middle path between liberal and realist theories, acknowledging the intricacies of the international system, where all parts of the system, states, individuals, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, multinational corporations, and non-state actors, have competing interests. Complex interdependence posits that networks of actors form to meet common goals. Complex interdependence has three principal tenets. There are many pathways actors can take to achieve their desired ends. These pathways are differentiated based on the abilities of each of the actors. All issues are of relatively equal importance to states. States see the use of force as relatively more costly than any gain it might achieve, and so may be inclined to chart paths of cooperation and the use of more stable institutional solutions. 44. Consider the relationship between the United States and China. 45 as a real-world modern example of complex interdependence in action. The economic linkages between the U.S. and China cannot be overstated. Those linkages keep the two countries locked in a long-standing, deeply complicated relationship. The United States relies heavily on the highly developed, highly efficient Chinese manufacturing sector, and the Chinese financial system buys up American government debt to back Chinese currencies. The international community relies on China to keep North Korea in line. However, these interdependencies do not stop China from choosing to engage in cyber warfare against the United States, nor do they prevent the United States from filing complaints against China for human rights violations. As the United States diplomatic boycott of the 2022 Summer Olympic Games 46 in Beijing illustrates, that China and the United States are a part of similar international organizations, such as the United Nations, where both countries hold veto power on the Security Council, does not prevent either country from using military might and prowess to signal its strength to the other country. Constructivism. The international system is both fragile and highly changeable. The anarchic nature of the system means that there is no centralized enforcement mechanism that can coerce states to act in a generally accepted manner. So, what keeps state actions within the boundaries of appropriate behavior? How do states even know what behavior is appropriate? Constructivism 47 posits that shared conceptions of the world, how the world works, what constitutes power, and who holds that power result in shared norms, expected patterns of behavior that align with the expectations and behavior patterns of others. For constructivists, these shared conceptions and resultant norms are the glue that holds the international system together. At its core, constructivism is about the interaction of many different actors within the system, each aiming to hold the others in line. According to constructivists, the perceptions states share about the world and the consequences that it is generally accepted a state might suffer should other states view it in a negative light, are what keeps state actions within the boundaries of appropriate behavior. For constructivists, how the world works and how it is perceived are not static. According to constructivism, the commonly accepted view of the world determines who has the most power to convey norms and to influence changes in norms and in ideas about how the international system should work. How the world is and how it works influence how actors choose to act, and this creates the norms and perceptions that will shape the world to come. What can be thought of as the new normal? One useful way to better understand the constructivist view is to use levels of analysis. At the individual level, leaders might try to use their own personal power and charm to shape the perceptions of other actors in the system. In order to change the behavior of other states to benefit their own purposes, leaders of states who are focused on projecting their own strength, such as Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong-un, seek to carefully craft what other leaders think of them. According to constructivists, states work to establish norms by modeling behavior and pressuring other states to emulate that behavior. For example, changes in a country's domestic law become part of that country's national identity. If a state chooses to enact a social safety net program, such as providing open access to education for all children, it can then pressure other states to enact a similar policy. States that enact similar policies sow relationships that can serve as a foundation on which other interactions or agreements can be built. At the systemic level, constructivism again prioritizes the importance of norms and the tendency of political actors to seek to align with those norms. The way states identify and place value judgments on democratic countries or rogue states can motivate an individual state to change its behavior. International organizations can establish specific rules or expectations of state behavior, placing further pressure on states to align their behavior with the rest of the world. Especially if being in the outgroup means that a state has fewer resources to support their own economic, political, or social standing. Consider recent developments in the relationships among China, Russia, and the United States. China and Russia are becoming allies as relations between the United States and these two countries grow more strained. Constructivists contend that how a state views itself, its national identity, affects its goals and how it views and interacts with other states. For decades, the United States has been the preeminent power in international relations, setting the tone for interactions. That may be changing. When Russia and China announced a sweeping, if informal, agreement declaring their friendship and opening the door for mutual cooperation, it appeared that the efforts of the United States to keep China neutral on the issue of Russia's aggressive stance toward Ukraine had failed. Though Russia and China are both powerful autocracies, as economist and former National Security Council official Andrew Weiss notes, they have not always viewed each other as strong allies. The Russians for the longest time were condescending in their view of China as an uninteresting rural society. Now China looks at Russia and says, "What are you good for?" 48 Foreign Affairs analyst Robin Wright contends that their new alliance challenges the United States as a global power, NATO as a cornerstone of international security, and liberal democracy as a model for the world. 49 In changing their views of each other and joining together to form an alliance, Russia and China seek to change the way they are viewed in the world, and in fact perhaps the way the world order itself has worked for decades. Where can I engage? International relations and international politics are always changing, so having the most up-to-date information and analysis possible is vital to understanding what is happening in the world. Podcasts provide a useful resource for up-to-date discussions of international politics. Some good podcasts to explore include Pod Save the World, Crooked Media. The Lawfare Podcast, the Lawfare Institute, is Off the Page, International Security. States must rely on norms to communicate expected behaviors. Norms can be repeated behaviors, such as the use of fiat currency, government-issued physical currency, the value of which is not linked to some other commodity, such as the gold standard, in modern economies. They can also be actions required by international law, such as the role the United Nations Security Council plays in dealing with matters of international conflict, or the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which prohibits state control over international waters beginning 5 miles outside of a state's continental shelf. 50 norms provide states with a starting point from which to weigh possible courses of action and determine how best to respond to any situation that may come up during the course of normal state relations. Video, Theory and Action, Constructivism. In the 1999 science fiction film, The Matrix, Neo has the ability to change the rules upon which his world is based. In this clip, Caleb Gallimore, then a PhD candidate at Ohio State University and now assistant professor of international affairs at Lafayette College, explains that this is how constructivists view international relations, contending that some actors have more power than others to change the system and how it works. If members of the international community consider a state's actions to be in conflict with existing norms, they may not consider that state to be a reliable ally. Once a state loses its standing as a positively regarded member of the international system, it can affect the way other states enter into agreements, whether they be economic or political. In an increasingly interdependent world, a state that is no longer able to enter into beneficial agreements with other states will have difficulty employing its resources in the most efficient way. Learning outcomes. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain Marxism, including its fundamental concepts and possible limitations or critiques. Explain feminism, including its fundamental concepts and possible limitations or critiques. Recall that a state's policy decisions are grounded in the general way it perceives the structure of the world, its place in the larger system, and what it believes would be necessary to secure and grow its position relative to other states. The perspectives of those in power tend to dominate discussions of international norms and theories of international relations. Those who see the system as fundamentally unjust have developed alternative theories to explain the way states act in the international system. Marxism. Marxism 51 emerged as a response to the rise of capitalism on the back of the imperial actions of the European powers. Karl Marx asserted that the individuals who controlled the factors of production in a country, the land and physical resources, the labor force, the capital needed for investment in the facilities and processes of an economy, and the entrepreneurship and creativity that drives economic growth and diversification, had too much power over its social norms. According to Marx, over the long term, those in power seek to create institutions that further entrench the stratification of the classes of a population, keeping wealth in the upper classes and leaving the lower classes with significant obstacles to their individual advancement. Marxist states seek to promote equality among all people so that each individual has the same opportunities to further their own wealth and success. These states seek to develop an international system in which societies invest internally to focus on the development of their own power and their own means of production so that the producing state gains the most from those products to the benefit of its own citizens. Proponents of dependency theory 52 argue that the stratification of countries in the international system is based around core countries and periphery countries. This view is known as the core-periphery model. 53 core countries, such as the United States and the United Kingdom, are more developed than most other countries, with more stable political and social institutions and higher-order economic systems. These states rely on developing, or what were once called third world countries, periphery countries, that are rich in extractive resources the core countries need to maintain their status. Earlier, the chapter discussed comparative advantage and trade as the basis for international relations. Dependency theory suggests that countries that are able to produce higher-order goods and services, such as technologically advanced products like machinery and computers, are better suited to protect their power in the long term. To entrench this advantage, core states have an incentive to keep periphery countries in positions of political and social unrest, so that the core countries may extract the needed resources with minimal costs. At its core, dependency theory rests on Marxist views that those who control the factors of production have the ability to exploit workers. Marxism argues that the pursuit of equality is more assured if the control of society is given to those doing the work to bring about societal progress. Feminism. Feminist theory promotes equality among all people, regardless of biological sex or sociological gender. According to feminist theory, traditional views of international relations consider the state to be the main actor in the international system 54, and the feminist tradition views the state as an inherently masculine institution in that it is, and has been dominated by men and the male point of view since its inception. As such, according to feminist theory, international relations has traditionally focused on hard policy issues, such as conflict and security, and has concentrated primarily on the actions of men. It has relegated to second-class status issues related to development and access to social programs. The end of the Second World War saw a huge shift in the role of women in society in general, ushering in a corresponding shift in the priorities of state policies toward the inclusion of more social programs. Since that time, the number of women in positions of power within governments has steadily increased. Women such as Sirimavo Bandaranaike of Sri Lanka, the first woman to be elected a prime minister, have introduced policies in their countries focusing on the health, safety, and welfare of women and children, alongside issues of national security and military engagement, leading to an increased focus on these policies in the international arena. Sirimavo Bandaranaike sits at a desk holding a pen over a small stack of papers. Figure 14. 13. When she was elected in 1960, Sirimavo Bandaranaike of Sri Lanka became the first woman prime minister in the world. Credit: Sirimavo Bandaranaike, Prime Minister of Ceylon and member of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party Head and Shoulders portrait, seated at desk, facing left by United Press International, UP/Library of Congress. Public domain. Issues like poverty, infant and maternal mortality, access to education, and violence against women have become a more central part of the conversation in organizations like the United Nations. As more women become part of the policy-making process, the areas that were once relegated to women's issues are being recognized as issues that affect everyone and that must be dealt with to help support vibrant, growing, prosperous societies. It is worth noting that the scholarship of international relations as a whole has followed the slow track of progress to include women in the field. Especially in the case of scholarship related to conflict and security issues, women have been left out of the conversation, and the overwhelming perspective of work has been that of the heteronormative white male. This lack of diversity in the contributors to the scholarship has led to a lack of objectivity in the scope and process of the study of international relations. As the body of international relations, scholars has incrementally, albeit marginally, diversified. The breadth and depth of the scholarship of the field has followed. As the people working in the field of international relations diversifies, a diversity of new perspectives will emerge that can help the field as a whole meet the challenges of the modern system. Scholars such as University of Wisconsin, Green Bay professor Elise Cohen 55, and Harvard University professor Maya Sen are bringing their unique perspectives to the study of refugee rights and its associated policies and war, respectively.